got plenty of different things going on here and there, and it looks like we're live. I don't know if you've got an intro, but
Oh yeah, normally we just kind of like roll right into it, but now that we're live and you set it up, well, here we go. Welcome back, everyone. Uh, Super excited to have Ben Rogojan, the Seattle data guy, who's become a friend over the last year. So Ben, thanks so much for joining. I appreciate you taking the time to chat, and yeah, welcome everyone who's tuning in for I guess the second week in a row in which we're talking about data in the downturn. Obviously, it's been an interesting week uh, in the world in general, regardless, data related, not data related. But anyways, Ben, thanks again for joining.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you. I'm glad you survived the week.
Yeah, man, it's been crazy. Um, I at least we have access to our capital again, so that's progress. But yeah, it was totally nuts. For anyone who's tuning in, our company Workstream.io. If you were not aware, got caught up in the whole SVB madness, and so between last Thursday and really Monday, there was tons of scrambling going on, trying to maintain access to our accounts and all that good stuff. So, anyways, Ben and I have been talking about it a little bit here and there offline, but yeah. Did you have like clients, or I mean, did you see anything from your side abnormal in the last week?
I mean, I think there's a few people who are maybe a little less communicative. I had a few investments that I didn't want to like bug. I was like, your VCs are probably bugging you far more than I am, or probably pinging you off the hook, like get your money off. I don't need to be that third voice or 20th voice telling you like, hey, where's my small angel check? Is it still there? Kind of vibe. So I was like, I should just chill and not let it be a problem for me.
Got it. But you didn't hear anything from your following folks that you work with more on a day to day, like the banking crisis didn't impact create impacts that you saw.
Right, nothing other than discussion, right? Like no one was like
Yeah.
dramatically impacted by it at the moment, right? Like luckily it was solved rather quickly. I'm sure had it been a week, I'm sure you would have seen people, because it's impossible for, right? Like Etsy wasn't able to pay people, like all these companies weren't able to pay people. There would have been some level of contagion from that perspective at the very least. So but over the weekend, I think most people were just like, "Oh, this is interesting, something to talk about." So,
Totally. Well, and now I forgot to kind of formally intro things more broadly because we got right into talking about it. But, Ben, for folks who don't already follow you, who might have just been hearing about the Seattle data guy for the first time, like just introduce yourself for anyone who might be tuning in and talk to us about your current work, your career, like how you've gotten here in data.
yeah, sure. So, hey everyone, thanks for jumping in. If you don't know me, yeah, I go by the Seattle Data Guy. Now in Denver, right? The open secret, which apparently you're also here with me. Been kind of doing the data engineering, data analytics kind of work probably for the last near decade now. And then also been putting out content in this space for I think 6 or 7 years at this point. I say that because I was looking back at an article from 2017 that I wrote, and I was like, oh wow, it's been a long time. So my focus though at this point is consulting and helping companies kind of find value from data, or simplify their data infrastructure, or find the right tools, build the right solutions, kind of space. So that's really where I'm focused at this point. But that's after kind of doing data engineering in various industries, including healthcare. I worked for Facebook for a few years, and just pretty much almost every other industry, it feels like at this point. So.
Very cool. So how did, obviously you've been doing thought leadership, writing about data for a long time, but the consulting transition is a little newer. So like how did you make that change, and like what led up to that?
Yeah, so I've been consulting on and off, when projects came up pretty early on. I had someone who reached out to me back in like 2016. They just needed help migrating something from Access to SQL Server. So that's, a long time ago, not that long ago, but it feels like a long time ago when you reference Access. So like they just needed help with that for an insurance provider. And so I set up an LLC. For some reason, like Seattle Data Guy sounded catchy, so I was like, I'll do that. And then I just
so this was like 7 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so I kind of did it on and off for a while there. And then I was kind of writing during that same period for both for my own, edification, for fun, for multiple reasons. And that kind of built up, my background and my experience. And, now it kind of came to a head where like I had so much content out there that I really don't do a ton in terms of like sales. I just, I get enough people that are interested in what I do from like just content at this point.
Very, very cool. But what was the like, was it just so much inbound interest that you're like, hey, I could create a career out of being a consultant? Or what was that compelling event that made you jump to do your own thing?
Yeah, a combination of enough interest, kind of improving how I ran the business itself. I used to be a little more loose in terms of like, oh yeah, I'll just do this hourly project and help you out. And that's really not sustainable when you're trying to consult, and you have to have some idea of where you're targeting and where you're going for the year. So just being better at like framing projects and framing value and things of that nature, which just came with time, came with learning from other people who also consult and do a really good job at that. So yeah,
cool. So we were kind of talking about this a little bit around SVB specifically, but I think more broadly, right? We're in this very interesting like macroeconomic moment in tech. I think moment in data too, right? And you just have so much exposure through your thought leadership, through your business, through the meetups that you help organize. I'd just be curious, like when you think of the impacts of the downturn on data work and data teams, like are there themes that you're seeing or that you hear people talking about a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of like micro themes that you'll find in this space, right? Like one theme that always, or that's definitely been pushed this year is doing more with less, right? Like people trying to figure out how can they get more from their data and data teams without hiring massively and needing 30 people to do something. So people are relooking at like kind of their infrastructure, relooking at kind of like how their teams are set up. I've seen companies completely get rid of data teams or get rid of their more technical support, which has been interesting. I've had clients that like maybe I like helped get to a certain point, then they hired a team, which is kind of usually the way I try to help people. So they I probably left them like 2 years ago, and then they ended up letting go of that data team, and now they're kind of coming back to me and being like, okay, we actually now need someone to help again. So there's kind of this interesting back and forth as I think things are correcting and people are trying to find like what's the right amount of people to support this data team. What are we actually trying to do with this data team? All those questions I think are coming about, right? Like at this point, this idea has been beat to death, but just that kind of conversion of like free money and like data at any cost and data insights at any cost, hit each other and grew. So everyone was growing teams, everyone was growing infrastructure costs. And now we're kind of at a point where it's like, all right, in a new world, what does this look like? Can we still do this? How do we actually drive value? So I think those are being posed more.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they're interconnected, but thinking about like investments in infrastructure versus investments in team are, I mean, they're interrelated, but they're kind of two different things. One's headcount related, one's like infrastructure related or technology related. At least on like the team side, as you've thought about the right size of a team, either now or like do you have any barometers for that? Like, how do you think about what's the right size of a data team?
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting point that I think would be worth digging into more. I mean, this is the first time someone's asked me that, which is like, yeah, that's.
I literally just thought about it when you were talking. So I mean,
yeah, it's like what is the right size? I was just talking to it's Mara Church. She used to be the like director of data science and data engineering at Patreon. And she was, this is less about the right size of team. But I think one interesting point that she brought out was like finding the right person, like level seniority wise, to do specific types of work. She's like, obviously in a perfect world, you want everyone to be senior and things like that so you can kind of let them go free, but like budget constraints don't let you do that. And so she had an interesting framework in terms of like, well, certain work you can probably, put on certain people based on their experience levels, based on the importance of that work, and making sure you find that balance with the work that you're doing. I thought that was interesting. So it's not the specific number, but I think that's also an interesting way of like figuring out, okay, who do you need on your team based on the type of work you're trying to do and get done.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer either. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like a leading question, right?
Yeah.
You were making me think about it. I used to work at a company that served IT people, and so those were our customers. So we talked a lot about what are those ratios look like, right? And so oftentimes folks talk about with like IT people, it's like 1 to like 100 employees is like an interesting ratio. I think it's similar with like people and culture teams. Um, I don't know if that's like the best barometer though for data work because businesses are so different and the way they use data is so different.
Yeah, plus like I don't know why that like it could sound low depending like because it's not just like the number of employees that you're dealing with, right? It's like from my perspective, and this could be somewhat tied to employees. It's like number of transactions that come into your databases, number of systems you
Yeah.
need to integrate. Obviously there's also only so fast that you can handle like the actual information itself, right? Like, okay, if you have 100 employees, only one of them, two of them need like some sort of metric or dashboard. Sure, but like I think again, the other side is like how many data systems are you trying to integrate, and how much data is coming in. And there's other things I think that are worth considering, but I
Yeah.
think those are
The
also
fo-
at play.
yeah, the teams that you have spoken with recently who maybe like came back to like re-engage you, and re-engage the Seattle data guy. What was did they give you ration? I mean, you obviously you can, make things generic, but were there explanations or reasons they had for like, hey, we laid off our data team? Did we
Yeah,
just
I
don't have
mean,
the budget, or were there other reasons behind that?
yeah, I think I'm sure in some case it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction for some teams. Like some teams probably cut off perfectly, like figured out exactly who they need. Um, I'm sure to another degree, other companies have swung too far and been like, let's just get rid of everybody and figure it out later. It's not a great way, but it's hard to say, right? Like there was kind of just this, I think, initial like sudden desire, like, hey, now is a good time. Let's just start, seeing how we can reduce headcount.
Yeah. No, the
But
reason I asked is because that's like another way of asking the previous question of what's the right size of your team, right? I mean, literally, people refer to layoffs as right sizing our organization. And so I would agree with you that I think most companies just slash because folks were telling them to slash, especially if you live within the echo chambers of tech. But you would hope that they would have been a little bit more nuanced about some of those decisions.
yeah, it's always hard, right? Doing any form of layoff, like at least just once you go down a few layers and are actually dealing with the people. I remember like I worked on a finance team when I started, and we like had to go through that suddenly, where it was like we were having to decide how people were going to get laid off. By that, I wasn't making the decision. It's just like part of the numbers you're giving is what
Mhm.
they're trying to figure out. And at the end of the day, they're just like, we need to lay off one engineer, one IT support person. Right? Like it's very agnostic to some degree, and it's really, I mean, to some degree, it's not to some degree, it is very sad, and it just comes down to numbers, right? Like you're just like, this is the budget we have. Things need to fit in it sometimes, and that's sometimes the approach.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I'm not trying to be callous about pushing this conversation. I think it is because it's something that's impacting lots of folks and lots of teams. It's worth asking the questions and trying to understand. I mean, this is not effectively, it is impacting people's livelihood and their lives. And so, if people are losing their jobs, you would hope that companies would have explanations for it beyond just like my investor told me to like lay people off.
No, but I think
I mean,
this is a time where people don't have to have an explanation, right? Like that's for the companies, that's their benefit. They're like, well, everyone's doing it, so I can do it, right? Like that's how they can explain it. Obviously, some are
Yeah.
probably seeing seat reductions. Like, I even I saw like plenty of reduction in various ways from my business for the year. It's just like, okay, yeah, I still have projects. Some of them are getting pushed till later time. Some of them are getting shrunk down, and that's it's just people trying to figure out what the right thing is. So it's happening in all degrees, right? Like people are like, okay, we still want to do this project, but maybe we push it off until Q2 versus Q1. We still want to do something with data, but instead of a $200,000 commitment, we're going to do like an 80 or a 50. So there's a lot of shifting and people trying to figure out what the correct numbers are here. So
Totally. Yeah, I mean, to your example about having worked in finance and being part of the team that was helping facilitate like layoffs. That's in many ways how I started my career. I mean, as terrible as it sounds, I was one of the first 100 employees at Tesla, and this was not Tesla the way Tesla is today. This was Tesla, 15 years ago.
yeah,
And the simple explanation I always tell people is I was employee 200 at Tesla. But the real answer was I was employee like 300 the Monday I joined, and by that Friday I was employee 200 because it was like I literally joined in finance, and the first thing that we did was lay a bunch of people off because the company wasn't hitting it. This was like right around the time, if folks have followed the Tesla story, that Elon was putting his like last reserve capital into the business as we were trying to get the Tesla Roadster to market. So we did a bunch of layoffs, and I was like in the weeds of all of that. And now that I've pressed you on the question of like, well, how are people making these decisions specifically around data? As I think back to those experiences, for sure, there were definitely like top-down drivers, right? This is how much money we can spend, this is how long we need it to last. But there was definitely a lot of, there was nuance there.
yeah,
It was more of a, I don't know, it was more of like taking a scalpel as opposed to like a sledgehammer approach to the organization. Um, and I think a lot of that was, I mean, it's like not, I mean, there was software engineering, but it was generally like engineering headcount that was getting laid off. And it was a lot of like, what are the functions or capabilities that we need to be investing in?
yeah,
And so let's continue to invest there. In some cases, we invested more in those areas. And then in other areas, there was oftentimes slashing and burning that would happen. But I mean, you're laying off 30% of your organization in that case. So it's pretty drastic.
yeah, yeah.
In that regard, like, and I know that it's not like your sample size is huge here. Have you heard more when you think of like roles in data or functions in data that have been impacted more? Is it more data engineering? You see like more folks on the BI, data analytics side being impacted? Anything to share there?
Yeah, it really has been a mix. I wouldn't say it's like one specific group, right? I I do think like analysts can generally stick around. Like, I mean, like if you just from my perspective, this is not like data. I'd imagine analysts sometimes can stick around a little more to a degree because it's easier to see what they do. And then, data engineers, it's harder to see what they do, but the analysts will eventually have a hard time doing what they do if you lay them off. So it could, I'd say I've seen it just about everywhere. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the analysts are often the ones that are kind of just jumping to whatever the business people are asking for, and which isn't necessarily like the greatest place for your data organization to be in, right? But to your point, there's visibility in what they do, and a lot of people rely upon them to answer the one-off question or build the next version of that dashboard.
yeah. Yeah, it's always the challenge of the data engineer, right? Like because you are neither developing features nor developing like something that is very tangible to the business, at least to the actual stakeholders. So sometimes you just are in this weird position where it's like, all right, okay, the company really is like, what do you do? I always poke at the fact that like a lot of like what's been done over almost the last decade plus has been around trying to eliminate that role to some degree, right? Like um, whether it's developing analytics engineers, whether it's developing certain tools like Fivetran or Portable or Airbyte or Estuary, right? the goal is really to try to reduce the reliance on this middle person, essentially, right? Like just get data from point A and put it into point B and let the analyst use it and the data scientists use it. And that's really been the goal. So it's interesting being in that position where it's like you're a cost to most people, and to some degree they almost don't understand why it's there until it's gone.
Yeah. I mean, but do you think that, I mean, obviously there's been this whole rise of, I mean, no one knew what analytics engineering was, maybe even 3 years ago. I mean, 5 years ago, no one had heard of I mean, I don't think they had invented the term. If you think about the future and this trend of, there's a lot of technology or new roles like eliminating data engineering, like, do you think that that is a future where data engineering isn't like one of the major functions within data organizations? Um, Go ahead. That was
Oh
the
no,
end.
okay.
That
I
was
was
the end
just
of
gonna
what I
wait.
was
I thought
going
you
to
had
ask
another
you.
point. Yeah. So I mean, I think right. Like the interesting thing to me about analytics engineers, like the role is in one capacity or another has always to me existed. I used to explain that data engineering kind of had two sides. It was a spectrum. Some people were more technical and software focused. Other people were a little more business focused, but still kind of in that like I develop, and architect data models kind of position. Um, so really, I just foresee things just specializing further, and maybe that middle space in between the difference become or the two different roles becomes more distinct, and maybe some of that middle stuff gets eliminated. But I still see you having those two roles. So maybe you don't have someone that's called data engineer anymore. Maybe you do. They're just on the software side now, right? They're still there. They're playing a role in the software engineering team, but they're just helping move the data in such a way that it's easy for the analytics engineer to kind of work with. Because generally the issue that happens in between there, and I think this is something that Chad
Mhm.
Sanderson covers a lot, is that the software team's focus is to make something functional, right? Like it's not how they're collecting data, it's not how the analysts are using the data. It's purely to make a software product. And so adding this other step where it's like, okay, on top of that, now take care of all this other stuff. That's just generally why it kind of gets pushed onto the data engineering team. So that's possibly what could happen. Maybe you have someone that's more on the software side that's like helping create data in such a way that like analytics engineers can work with it. But it's still going to be something very, I imagine, similar to what a data engineer. So will it go away? I mean, the work somehow it still needs to happen, right? Like that I don't think is necessarily going away. Some
Yeah.
sort
Well,
of
I mean,
works.
yeah.
But
I mean, that of what you're talking about. I mean, Portable, the Five Trends I mean, they can help you get your own proprietary product data, right? I mean, Fivetran doesn't have a no code like tool to allow you to pull proprietary data out of whatever technology product you sell.
sure.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, generally, like most of the proprietary stuff is usually in like a Postgres or MySQL database, so you can
yeah.
usually pull it that way. It's the next layer after that that's usually like sometimes
Okay.
that what you need, and then there are limitations like with like Airbyte I think has like 100 MB limitation on Postgres or something. So or it's not a limitation, it's just a preference based on their documentation. So and I think I've seen the similar issues with like other solutions where it's like they'll generally hit a scaling issue. So sometimes that's where you might need someone to come in if your company's large enough. It just depends.
Yeah. This is where it goes to show you that I'm not on the technical data engineering side of the house. I'm on the other side of the house. I'm asking you stupid questions.
Nope.
Um,
Not stupid questions.
um, Interesting. Uh, cool. Well, I don't know. I don't have anything else there for you. I'm very curious though, because you were posting about it yesterday. If you have any fresh takes on generative AI and GPT-4. So, anyways, new release out yesterday. Uh, anything new you got?
I mean, I've only like skimmed a lot of the stuff thus far. I think I need to go through. There's that whole research paper that's pouring out everywhere. I'm I think the one funny thing that I keep finding, at least a lot of the use cases that have been mentioned, and there's tons more, but there's always this common thread of like being better at like finding signal and noise to a degree. Like when you think about the initial thing that people thought about ChatGPT is like, oh, it'll kill Google by making it easier just to find the information you're looking for, right? Like instead of having to go to 100 different websites, it's like, hey, what if we just gave it to you? So, right, like there's too much data, so we've just condensed it down. I saw another person give an example of like, oh, we're creating a bot that sits on top of like your dating app and will swipe for you and do messaging for you between a person and another, like you and another person, based on your previous preferences and things of that nature. So it's like, again, kind of this weird signal and noise situation where it's like, okay, instead of you having to do something to like find the right person, a bot will do that. Of course, people were joking underneath, like, well, what if both people have bots? And it's just, bots talking to bots. And then, and someone made a joke, like, well, then they'll just fall madly in love and leave you two alone. So
that sounds great.
Right? Like the bots will just go off and do their own thing. So I thought that was funny. I also find that funny because it's like, these are things that in theory, these companies should be doing anyways, right? Like, it's like, well, a dating app, and I think Mary, who I believe is sitting right next to you, brought this up on one of her chats with Lauren, where it's like, in theory, they should be like providing you the best matches, but that's not what they're incentivized to do. They're incentivized to give you, to make you spend more time on the app and see ads and things of that nature. So funny point there. So it's like interesting in that regard, where it's like, okay, how would you then monetize this whole situation? Because if you remove this noise, which is a lot of ads and a lot of like wasted time, like where do you then go? So I think that's kind of what I've been thinking about. The one thing I really love the idea of possibly taking something similar to like GPT-4, sticking it on top of your like Snowflake or whatever instance, looking through all your previous queries, and it just like going and making it that much easier to like write your queries for a specific company, right? Like you take the model, you train it now on your specific data set. It now knows your data model. It now knows how you've run queries in the past, and now it can run optimal queries for you. And I think that's an interesting space that I'd like to see. So
totally. No, I mean, you kind of were just going where I was trying to lead you by transitioning out of impacts on data engineering team and chat GPT was, do you think or expect generative AI solutions like that to have impacts on data jobs and roles like data engineering in the future, or do you think that's not going to come to fruition?
yeah, I can definitely see it. I think the way I've been thinking about it recently has been like, oh, it'll like, it might be something like a Jarvis, I imagine, like in Iron Man, where it's just like, you kind of have an idea, and you just tell, your AI to basically like bring it to fruition, so to speak, right? And then you're kind of there assisting with it, is how I imagine it will be. It'll be more of like a fourth brain, so to speak. I think Google used to be referred to as like a third brain, and so you've kind of got this next level brain coming in, and I'm still surprised at how fast it's in theory moving. Because in history, it always feels like things tend to move. Like we get excited about these innovations, and then they usually get hung up for like 50 years. So I think that's how fast it's been, has been pretty crazy. So I'm curious to see kind of, GPT-5, right? Like I'm just like, all right, like what could that have that we don't already in theory are getting? So I think I'm curious if we'll even hit some sort of speed bump, because it usually happens. It's just kind of inevitable.
Yeah, totally. Have you used anything like GitHub Copilot so far? Like, I mean, that's maybe a little bit more on target for like engineering use cases than ChatGPT.
Yeah, I have, and I think, again, super helpful, helping you finish code, right? Like to that degree where it's like, yeah. I think that's definitely a use case that makes sense, and that's where I'm like, yeah, like what's the next level here?
I mean, that definitely fits into the Jarvis analogy, kind of. I mean, it's not like a full-on Jarvis of like, go generate this molecule, but it's kind of like helping you finish an idea that you already have.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe like, is that the thing that maybe you eventually run into an issue with, where it's like GPT can't like intuit new ideas, so to speak, right? Because I think that's something that's innately somewhat human, but like I am sure we can somehow model like innovation, right? Like how do you model that? And like, if all your data is horses, if you would put GPT in a world where everything was horses, would it have figured out what a car is? could it have done that? So I think that's kind of the place where I imagine humans continue to kind of win, but that'll be interesting. Hopefully I'm answering yours. Yeah. Hopefully
No, you
I feel
are. I
like I
mean,
went a little
it's
off topic there, but just a thought.
no, I mean, like a lot of the promise of this stuff, right, is that I mean, AI is a misnomer in and of itself, right? It's not. This is not really Skynet. It's machine learning, natural language processing, right? And so you can train it upon. You can train the algorithms on large data sets and to establish known patterns. So when like Chat GPT is talking to you, it's not like there's not like a person. There's not like a Skynet behind it. It's a model that's been trained to do specific things. So, anyways, the reason I went off on that tangent to explain that was um, ultimately what it's good at doing is not the like big thinking creative work. It's the co-pilot like completing code, the automating the repetitive stuff that previously you couldn't really automate, right? In the same way that like a no code tool, like a five train, whatever it is, right? Like could fill that void, right? Or have displaced what historically would actually have required a person to do, be an engineer or whomever else, right? And as I was joking at before, I'm just not super technical. And so when I think about data engineering work and data engineering workflows, like what are those things that are like the annoying, repetitive, low hanging fruit where you could insert a Jarvis to allow you to focus on what should we build and let them kind of build the annoying thing that you don't want to waste your time on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like generally that's like, and this is sometimes the analyst work too, but like doing like ad hoc analysis or creating ad hoc data sets suddenly where it's like, you know, we always joke, and there's that now I'm forgetting his name suddenly, but there's that one tweet that like always blows up if ever you post it, where it's like, them like, can you create this data set in like 30 minutes? And it's like, yeah, let me just select from this perfectly clean data
The
set.
perfect like clean data set doesn't exist. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm spacing on name right now, but yeah, I imagine to some degree you might be able to eliminate some of that. Um, I'm really curious to see like when you start like sometimes you'll go into a query and see it's like 1,000 lines, and as much as we can joke and say like, well, that shouldn't happen, it's like it happens all the time. So I'm curious if then, ChatGPT, like, can I give it the instructions and will it take more time for me to think how to write that or provide it that information than just writing it myself? Like that's kind of, I think, the interesting side to things is like, okay, when things get really, really big, how can we still use it? Like, are there ways we can piecemeal this idea? I imagine it could be possible, but it's more just curious.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, what a lot of folks talk to us about, or what we're starting to talk with folks more and more about, when people think about where WorkStream IO, like our solution fits in, one of the areas it fits in is kind of disrupting kind of service desks, right? Or like service desk dynamics that your data team might experience. And there's lots of ways today that we can make that better. We can make that more seamless. And the intention of bringing this up isn't for this to be an advertisement for my product. It was to say that where people then always ask us is like, well, this is great, but if an end user asks a question that has already been asked before, can generative AI or is there machine learning that could just suggest that to people, right?
Yeah.
And historically, like if you asked me a year ago, I would give you the the founder like nod, like smile, and if I'm not live with you and a bunch of people on LinkedIn, I would call it the smile F word. Um, uh, when people give it to me, when I'm like trying to pitch them. Anyways, the point being, I wouldn't have had an answer for how we would have delivered that, right? Because we'd have to go build like machine learning and AI into our product, and there's just no way we would have been able to do that, right? With capabilities like this, there actually become really interesting opportunities to go ahead and start to automate to not only make experiences better, but automate that based off of like information that organizations might have put into our product. And so I just think there's really, really fascinating applications of this technology all around the place. And I think to relate it back to the kind of the topic of today about data in the downturn and people rationalizing costs, it kind of goes to, well, like, how do you think about where you invest in technology versus where do you think about people, and what's the giving get in that relationship? And I don't think any of us really know what the impact is going to be
Mm.
in all of these different parts of the kind of the data stack. I think to your point, right? Like, um, you can't really use the number, a people ratio to say how big your data team should be, because every company has a different amount of data, and then that data might result in needing a different number of insights or dashboards as like a quote unquote output. So like how do you use like a people ratio there, right?
Yeah.
Um, but stuff like generative AI could fit into a lot of different places where today all we have no option today other than to kind of throw manpower at it, which this is probably the future. We just don't know what that future looks like necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that someday, probably soonish, right? Like people will probably figure out, like you said, like it's a way to reduce manpower. But I think there are always interesting cases that you hear, um, that I'm always like, but will that work? And it's not to like shoot anyone down. It's just the AI still has to function in a human world thus far until it, takes over, and we're all serving our AI masters. But it still has to function in that. So like you'll hear like, oh well, this will get rid of like SDRs, or someone that's like in sales, and it's like, but I don't know. I guess I imagine like sales is such a human thing that's like, can you though? Like I don't think I'd appreciate a bunch of spammy personalized messages, right? Like it's like I think I saw someone do that. It's like, oh, here's how you set up like 1,000 personalized messages, and then like that just further creates a lot of noise that you have to now filter through. So I'm always curious there, where it's like, I mean, a person still has to eventually interact with this thing. So you either have to remove the person, and it's just like a decision that an AI now deals with and makes the decision for, or you don't eliminate the person that's making that decision to take a call with a sales rep or something, whether it's AI or not. And then they have to somehow flood or deal with all of this noise that's coming at them. So I think that's always the other aspect that I'm like, how will this work? You know.
Totally. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I'm with you. I'm kind of skeptical on the SDR sales. I mean, so much of that type of work is listening, really, right? I mean, a lot of data work is listening too, right?
Yeah.
But that goes to like big brain or left brain, whatever the expression is, thinking, which is not what at least this version of AI does. You really need true AI for stuff for something like that. And hopefully, we're at least another 10 years from Skynet, starting a nuclear holocaust. Um, cool. Well, we normally go for about 30 minutes. We're as always, running a little bit over. Um, thanks so much for joining. Before I let you go and we wrap, like, I don't know, any parting thoughts about generative AI, data in the downturn, things that you're seeing in general that we didn't get an opportunity to get into?
I mean, I definitely have. I mean, I'm definitely poking at some people to talk more about generative AI, because I know a few people who definitely spend a lot more time, even like down to the technical level of this thing. So I'm definitely interested in talking to them and hearing from them and their perspective, just because it's it's such a like it's crazy how far things have come, like in a long time, in a short time. I was just looking over an article where I talked about like computer vision, and like how we got to where we are with that, and how like it was based off of a lot of research that um, figured out how the human brain essentially operates and
Mhm.
depicts images, and figures out what images are. Um, so I think that's crazy. And yeah, I don't know. I definitely have a lot more interest in wanting to learn on it, but I don't think I have any specific questions, because it's like I really do want to talk about people who are like doing this kind of work, and like, all right, what's actually possible? Because we can pontificate forever, but it's like, what are we actually seeing? What are we actually like? What use cases actually make sense? So
For sure. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing and reading you get more into that, because I'm sure you're going to cover some fun insights for the rest of us. So please continue to pull that thread on behalf of myself and your entire audience.
Yeah, perfect, awesome.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks again for joining. Thanks everyone for listening in. And as always, we will see you next week.
Yep.
Have
See
a good
you.
one.
Well, I won't be here, but
See ya.
see you.
You should listen in next week. Come on, man.
Yes.